Okay, so the first topic we're going to be looking at today is religion and conflict. Now, once again, I want you to have a look at these key words. One of these words will be coming up in the exam. You must be familiar with all of them. So have a look at our key words. We have conflict, just war, non-violent protest, pacifism, reconciliation, moral evil, and natural evil. Now I want you to just take a couple of minutes and have a look at these words. Do you know what they mean? Write them down. At this point, pause the video before we move on to the next part. Okay, so we're looking at how religious people respond to suffering. So straight away, we know that we're focusing on Christianity and Islam from your previous exam. So here are what some Christians think about suffering, and here are what some Muslims think about suffering. Muslims believe it is part of Allah's plan, that He will not give people more than they can bear. They believe that suffering is a test, and depending on how well you do or how well you deal with the suffering will depend on how well you get judged on the last day. They believe that suffering brings a person closer to God, because when you're suffering, you're more likely to pray, read the Quran, go to mosque and be around other people. And last but not least, if you should see other people suffering, then what you need to do is you need to give zakah, you need to give to charity, you need to give them support. For Christians, they believe that life is not meant to be easy. They believe, similar to Muslims, that it tests your character. They believe that we have free will, and actually, so a lot of suffering happens because we allow it to happen, and we make it happen. But most importantly, they believe that actually suffering, if it's done by God, we cannot understand it because we are finite beings and God is infinite, and therefore we must trust God with what He's doing. Now, if you get a question in the exam and it talks about how you should respond to suffering, ways to respond to suffering would include prayer, giving to charity, helping people who are suffering so they don't suffer. The second topic we'll be looking at is war. So again, we'll be looking at Christian attitudes to war. So we know that with Christianity, they don't really agree with war, and their war is rarely justified. At all opportunities, war should be avoided, and if people do go to war, if Christians do accept war for any reason, well, it must follow the just war theory. The aim of Christianity is to promote peace, and war may sometimes be the tool needed to do this. So, for example, in World War II, going to war was a lesser evil than allowing the injustice of all the Jews to be killed, and so in that situation, some Christians may agree with war, but it has to be for a just cause. Now, fundamentally, these are the religious ideas. This quote here: "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." So write that quote down. What does that quote suggest about Christian attitudes to war? Does it suggest they're for war, against war? And what kind of people are referred to as God's children? The people who create war, or otherwise? So that's the quote you would use to highlight the Christian perspective on what they think about war. In Islam, war is allowed. Please remember the difference between lesser jihad and greater jihad. You tend to think that greater jihad means, the greater battle, but the greater battle occurs internally inside a person. So we are allowed to do lesser jihad, which is the external fighting, the external struggle. But the greater jihad is the internal struggle. This is where a person strives to be righteous, strives to be holy, strives to do what is right in all situations, and that's more difficult. That's why it's called greater jihad. Also, Muslims are allowed to go to war if they have been attacked, or if another nation is oppressing a Muslim nation. But although they allow war and they agree with war and they are not pacifists, they believe that war should be conducted with the minimum necessary force, without anger, and you should treat all people humanely. So under no circumstance can a Muslim then start, doing crimes or performing crimes or harming the animals or harming innocent people that are not fighting. The war must be only towards those who are fighting. So have a look at this quote from the Quran. What's this telling us? Fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress the limits. What are the limits? And in this situation of war, it could be rape, violence, killing, hurting the innocent, destroying property that has nothing to do with the war. These will be the limits. So Muslims are allowed to war, but they cannot go over the limits. They cannot transgress the limits. And that is the quote you would use. And you would argue that in Islam they are allowed to go to war. However, they must conduct themselves with the necessary force, without anger, and they must treat all people humanely. Now, pacifism. Muslims are not pacifists, but you often get Christians are. Some people are pacifists and they are non-religious. But the whole idea of pacifism comes from here. Have a read of that. So if you look at that quote from Matthew, what's Jesus telling people to do and to whom? What is Jesus telling people to do and to whom? And also you've got the sixth commandment, you shall not murder, and that's quite clear. Now, this is an alternative view. In the Old Testament, you have a quote that says, if there is a serious injury, you are to take a life for an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a hand for a hand, and a foot for a foot. So some Christians argue that violence and vengeance is okay. However, most Christians would not agree with this idea because the teachings of Jesus are very, very clear. He promotes forgiveness, he promotes care, and not retribution. And so what Christians must do is they shouldn't go back and fight and try and get vengeance, but they must forgive and love their enemies, which is a difficult thing to do. And that's the religious teaching on pacifism. The reason why we don't have Muslim teaching on pacifism is because there is none. They are not pacifists. Okay, and forgiveness. So this is a straightforward one. Bear with each other and forgive whatever problems you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Now that's the quote you would use, or that's the part of the quote you would use. It's very, very clear. And then the other one says, never underestimate the power of asking for forgiveness. It is a weapon to bring you back to Allah. Now that's an important quote from Islam. It says that forgiveness is a weapon, which means rather than thinking it's a weakness, it's a strength. And you want to make sure you highlight this when you're writing either an explanation or religious teaching on forgiveness. Now you must have an alternative view to forgiveness, and the alternative view is this. If somebody has committed an offense against you and you forgive them and they repeat it, and you forgive them and they repeat it, and you forgive them and they repeat it, then you've got to ask yourself, actually, is this what you want to do? Is this right? So you can forgive, but you must be aware that in some situations, your alternative view is in some situations, forgiving is not a good thing to do or the best thing to do because the person might take advantage. Now, one thing I did want to highlight is there is no quote in the Bible that says forgive and forget, so do not write that down. Never write down forgive and forget because it is not a religious quote. It's just what people say. Alright, have a look at these questions. There's a 4 mark, a 6 mark, and an 8 mark. Have a look at it. Practice these questions. See what you get. Give it to myself, Mr. Odegawa, or Mr. Morgan, and we will mark it for you. Hopefully you found this useful. Good luck with the other 2 sessions. There are 3 more sessions after this. Summarize the total view and what we went through today.